You can keep the memories. I'll keep everything that matters." The words landed harder than the judge's gavel. A few people in the courtroom laughed under their breath. One woman didn't even bother hiding her smile. Charlotte Hayes sat perfectly still at the end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while her soon-to-be ex-husband enjoyed the attention. Ryan Hayes leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the story was already over. Beside him sat his fiancée, young, elegant, and visibly pleased to be there. She glanced at Charlotte the way people look at an old photograph they no longer need. The hearing had not even officially begun, yet the outcome seemed obvious to everyone in the room. Ryan had the house. Ryan had the investments. Ryan had the business connections. Ryan had the future. Charlotte had a simple navy blue dress, a wedding ring she no longer wore, and a reputation people described with one painful word: unfortunate. The judge reviewed the final paperwork while quiet conversations moved through the gallery. Charlotte could hear fragments without trying. "Poor thing. She should have fought for more. I heard she's leaving with almost nothing." The whispers spread like ripples across still water. Ryan heard them too. His smile widened. Then he did something subtle. Something cruel enough to make several people glance at each other. He pushed the settlement folder across the table with 2 fingers and said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. Charlotte agreed to every term. Another wave of murmurs followed. The message was clear. She had surrendered. She had lost. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the documents. 43 pages reducing 11 years of marriage into signatures and legal language. She turned a page slowly, then another. Her face revealed nothing. That seemed to frustrate Ryan more than anger ever could. He wanted tears. He wanted resistance. He wanted proof that he still had power over her. Instead, she simply picked up the pen. Across the room, Ryan's fiancée crossed her legs and exchanged a knowing look with a friend seated behind her. The friend smiled. Charlotte noticed. She noticed everything. The smiles, the whispers, the quiet judgment hanging in the air. Yet something unexpected happened. As she prepared to sign, a brief vibration came from her purse. Just once. A message. She didn't look at it immediately. She signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Every signature seemed to convince the room that she was exactly what they thought she was: defeated. When she finally glanced at her phone, her expression did not change. Not even slightly. She simply locked the screen and returned it to her purse. No one saw the message. No one knew what it said. But for the first time that morning, Charlotte's shoulders relaxed. It was such a small change that nobody noticed. Nobody except an older court clerk standing near the wall. The woman studied Charlotte for a moment, as if she had seen something everyone else had missed. Ryan certainly missed it. He was too busy enjoying his victory. He looked around the courtroom like a man celebrating a promotion. And perhaps he believed he deserved it. After all, his career had never been stronger. His company was expanding. His income had doubled in 3 years. His social circle admired him. His future appeared limitless. Meanwhile, Charlotte was signing away nearly everything. At least that was the version of the story everyone could see. What none of them knew was that some stories become most dangerous right after people stop paying attention to them. The final page slid across the table. Charlotte signed her name one last time. Ryan released a satisfied breath. The judge nodded. The gallery relaxed. The humiliation was complete. Or so they thought. Because while everyone in that courtroom was busy watching a woman lose everything, not one of them realized they were witnessing the final moments of the only version of Charlotte Hayes they had ever known. Most people in that courtroom believed they knew exactly how Charlotte Hayes ended up there. They saw a woman signing divorce papers and assumed she had contributed little to the life she was leaving behind. Ryan certainly encouraged that version of the story. It was cleaner that way. Simpler. Easier to explain at dinner parties and corporate events. What nobody mentioned was what life looked like 11 years earlier, before the tailored suits, before the promotions, before Ryan Hayes learned how success could make people forget who helped them reach it. Back then, their first apartment sat above a noisy laundromat on the edge of Columbus. Every evening, the sound of machines rattled through the floorboards. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. Yet Charlotte used to smile every time Ryan came home. Because at that stage, they were building something together. Ryan worked long hours at a sales company. Charlotte worked at a medical office during the day and handled freelance bookkeeping at night. Some weeks, she slept less than 5 hours a night. Not because she had to, because she believed in him. When Ryan talked about earning an MBA, she was the one who calculated the tuition costs. When he worried about paying for classes, she picked up extra work. When he felt overwhelmed, she stayed awake listening to him until 2 in the morning. Nobody applauded those sacrifices. Nobody noticed them. They happened quietly, behind closed doors, where most important things happen. Years later, when Ryan finally graduated, Charlotte sat in the audience holding flowers. Ryan thanked his professors. He thanked his mentors. He thanked his colleagues. He forgot to mention the woman who had spent years carrying half the weight so he could keep moving forward. Charlotte never complained. She convinced herself it was not important. Then came the promotions, the larger office, the business trips, the expensive dinners, the new people entering Ryan's world. At first, the changes were small. A missed anniversary, a canceled weekend, a phone turned face down during dinner. Tiny cracks that seemed harmless until they connected. One evening, Charlotte prepared his favorite meal after he returned from a 3-day conference in Chicago. The food sat untouched for nearly an hour. Ryan was busy answering messages. She watched the blue light from his phone reflect across his face while the candles slowly burned down. That was the first time she felt lonely sitting beside her. On husband. The distance grew month by month. Conversations became shorter. Excuses became easier. Then one night, she attended a company celebration with Ryan. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Executives shook Ryan's hand. People praised his achievements. Charlotte stood beside him smiling politely until a woman approached and said something that stayed with her long after the evening ended. "You must be so proud of everything he built." Charlotte smiled and nodded. But on the drive home, she stared through the passenger window and realized something painful. Nobody knew she had helped build it too. Not anymore. Somewhere along the way, she had become invisible. Ryan never corrected them. He never told the story differently. And perhaps that was the moment their marriage truly began to end. Not with a fight, not with a betrayal, but with a silence that kept growing until it filled every room they shared. The end of a marriage rarely happens in a single moment. Looking back, Charlotte could see dozens of warning signs she had ignored, each one small enough to explain away at the time. The late meetings, the canceled dinners, the growing distance in Ryan's voice whenever she asked simple questions. But the truth finally arrived on an ordinary Thursday evening. Ryan walked through the front door carrying a leather briefcase and the faint smell of expensive cologne. Charlotte had spent the afternoon preparing dinner. The table was set. Candles flickered softly against the dining room windows. For a few seconds, she allowed herself to believe they might have a normal evening together. Ryan loosened his tie, glanced at the table, and barely reacted. Then his phone lit up. A smile appeared on his face instantly. It was small, almost invisible, but Charlotte noticed it. She noticed because she had not seen that smile directed at her in a very long time. He spent most of dinner staring at his screen. Every few minutes another message arrived. Another smile followed. Charlotte asked about his day. Ryan answered with one-word responses. Finally, she stopped talking altogether. The silence between them felt larger than the house itself. 3 weeks later, the truth became impossible to ignore. Ryan attended another company event. Charlotte arrived later than planned after finishing work. The ballroom was crowded with executives, investors, and their spouses. Music drifted through the room. Waiters carried silver trays between groups of guests. Charlotte searched for Ryan near the stage and spotted him standing beside a young marketing consultant named Vanessa. They were laughing. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing dramatic. Yet something about the way Ryan looked at her made Charlotte stop walking. It was the same expression he once reserved for his wife. That night Ryan came home after midnight. Charlotte was waiting in the living room. Neither of them raised their voices. Neither of them argued. In some ways, that made it worse. Ryan simply sat across from her and admitted what she already knew. His feelings had changed. He wanted something different. He wanted a different future. 11 years together reduced to a calm conversation that lasted less than 20 minutes. Charlotte listened without interrupting. When he finished speaking, she asked only one question. Was there someone else? Ryan hesitated. The hesitation gave her the answer. After that, everything moved quickly. Lawyers appeared. Documents arrived. Friends began choosing sides. The people who once filled their home during holidays suddenly stopped calling Charlotte. Invitations disappeared. Group messages became quieter whenever she joined. Ryan's professional success made his version of events easier for others to accept. He was charismatic, influential, respected. Charlotte became a footnote in a story he now controlled. Then came the engagement announcement. Only 4 months after filing for divorce, Ryan posted photographs online. Smiling faces, champagne glasses, a diamond ring sparkling beneath restaurant lights. Hundreds of comments appeared within hours. Congratulations. Perfect couple. So happy for you both. Charlotte looked at the screen for less than 10 seconds before setting her phone aside. The next morning, she deleted every social media account she had. Friends interpreted her silence as heartbreak. Some assumed she was hiding. Others assumed she was struggling. The rumors spread easily because nobody actually knew where she was. One by one, familiar connections faded away. Yet while everyone else was busy discussing her downfall, Charlotte was making a decision. She packed 2 suitcases, folded the last of her clothes, removed her apartment key from the ring. Then she stood in the middle of the empty living room and took one final look around. There was no anger left, no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet understanding that the woman who had spent years living in Ryan Hayes' shadow could not remain there any longer. By sunrise the next morning, Charlotte was gone. And for the first time in years, nobody knew where to find her. The first morning in her new apartment felt strangely quiet. No notifications, no schedules built around someone else, no footsteps moving through another room, just sunlight spilling across a hardwood floor and the distant sound of traffic drifting through a partially open window. Charlotte stood in the middle of the small living room holding a mug of coffee and realizing she had no idea what came next. For years, her life had been measured by Ryan's ambitions, Ryan's deadlines, Ryan's goals. Now there was only an empty calendar and a future nobody had planned for her. The apartment was barely 600 square feet. The furniture came from discount stores and online listings. The kitchen counter had a scratch running across one corner. The bedroom window overlooked a parking lot instead of a skyline. Yet for the first time in years, every inch of the space belonged entirely to her. The first few weeks were harder than she expected. Not because she missed Ryan. What she missed was certainty. She missed knowing what tomorrow would look like. Every morning, she sat at a small table near the window and searched for freelance bookkeeping contracts. Some days she found one. Some days she did not. Her savings account moved in only one direction. More than once she stared at her banking app and wondered whether everyone had been right about her. Maybe she had lost too much. Maybe starting over at 38 was impossible. Then something happened that changed the way she saw herself. One afternoon, a client accidentally sent an email praising her work to the entire project team. It was a small mistake, nothing remarkable. Yet Charlotte found herself reading the message 3 times. Reliable, professional, exceptional attention to detail. The words stayed with her for the rest of the day. Nobody had described her that way in years. Somewhere along the road, she had become so focused on supporting another person's success that she stopped recognizing her own value. That realization became a turning point. Slowly, she began saying yes to opportunities she would have ignored before. She enrolled in certification courses. She attended networking events. She updated her resume. She introduced herself with confidence instead of apology. Every small decision added another brick to a foundation she was rebuilding from scratch. Meanwhile, life continued elsewhere. Occasionally, mutual acquaintances shared updates about Ryan. Another promotion, another company event, another vacation. Charlotte listened politely and changed the subject. To their surprise, she never seemed interested. The more she focused on her own growth, the less room she had left for old wounds. Months passed. Seasons changed. The woman who had arrived carrying 2 suitcases slowly disappeared. In her place emerged someone steadier, stronger, more comfortable in her own skin. One evening after finishing work, Charlotte walked home through downtown streets glowing beneath rows of warm lights. Store windows reflected passing cars and crowded restaurants. She paused outside a bookstore she had never noticed before. A handwritten sign advertised a local author event. On impulse, she stepped inside. The smell of paper and coffee filled the air. People moved quietly between shelves. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely at ease. She wandered toward the business section and reached for a book resting on the top shelf. At the exact same moment, another hand reached for it from the opposite side. Charlotte pulled back immediately. "Sorry," she said with a small laugh. You saw it first. The man standing across from her smiled. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed simply in a dark jacket with no sign of wealth or status. Actually, he replied, taking the book from the shelf before offering it to her. I think you need it more than I do. Charlotte smiled politely and accepted the book. It seemed like nothing. A brief encounter between strangers in a bookstore on an ordinary evening. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple moment was about to change far more than either could imagine. Charlotte expected never to see the man from the bookstore again. It had been a brief encounter, the kind people forget before the day is over. Yet 3 days later, as she sat in a corner cafe reviewing client accounts on her laptop, a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. I had a feeling you would order the same thing twice. She looked up and found him standing there with a coffee cup in one hand and a calm smile that somehow felt both confident and unassuming. Charlotte laughed softly. That sounds like a dangerous amount of observation. Or a very safe prediction, he replied. He gestured toward the empty chair across from her. May I? There was something different about him. Not charm, not charisma. She had spent years around successful people and knew how easily those qualities could become performances. This felt quieter, more genuine. Charlotte nodded, and he joined her table. Over the next hour, they talked about books, travel, work, and the strange ways people reinvent themselves after life changes unexpectedly. He introduced himself simply as Jonathan. No last name, no impressive titles, no attempts to impress her. When she asked what he did for a living, he smiled and said he spent most of his time helping businesses solve problems. It sounded ordinary enough. Weeks passed, and their paths continued crossing in surprisingly natural ways. Sometimes at the bookstore, sometimes at the cafe, once at a public lecture downtown. Charlotte never felt pursued. If anything, Jonathan seemed unusually respectful of her space. He listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, remembered details, the small things most people forgot. One evening they walked through a Riverside Park as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Charlotte found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else. Not details about the divorce, not bitterness, just the truth about how difficult it had been learning who she was after years of defining herself through someone else's success. Jonathan listened quietly. Then he asked a question nobody else had ever asked. What did you want before everyone else's expectations got involved? Charlotte stopped walking. The question lingered between them. She realized she did not immediately know the answer. That bothered her more than she expected. Jonathan did not push further. He simply waited. Eventually she smiled. I think I am still figuring that out. That sounds like a good place to start, he said. What Charlotte did not know was that Jonathan's life was far less ordinary than he allowed people to believe. More than once she noticed strange details that did not fit the image he presented. A driver occasionally dropping him off several blocks away before meetings. Phone calls that ended the moment she approached. Restaurant managers greeting him with unusual familiarity. Once she accidentally saw a financial magazine featuring a photograph that looked remarkably similar to him. Before she could take a closer look, someone picked up the magazine from the table. The mystery lingered. Yet she never asked questions, and Jonathan never volunteered answers. Meanwhile, her own life continued improving. New clients arrived through referrals. Certifications led to larger projects. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt respected for her abilities rather than her relationship status. Then one afternoon, almost a year after she had disappeared from Ryan's world, an envelope arrived at her apartment. The return address belonged to a law firm she recognized immediately. Her stomach tightened before she even opened it. Inside was a notice regarding a final court hearing connected to unresolved financial matters from the divorce settlement. She read the document twice, then a third time. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks away. The same courthouse, the same people, the same chapter she thought had already ended. That evening she sat quietly by her window watching city lights flicker across the darkening streets below. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan appeared. How was your day? Charlotte stared at the screen for a moment before replying honestly. More complicated than it was this morning. Less than a minute later, another message arrived. Whatever it is, you will not be facing it alone. Charlotte read those words twice. Then she looked toward the envelope resting on the table. For the first time since receiving it, she felt completely calm. 3 weeks passed faster than Charlotte expected. The court notice remained on her kitchen counter the entire time, its presence impossible to ignore. Every morning she saw it while making coffee. Every evening she saw it before turning off the lights. At first it felt like a threat from a life she had worked hard to leave behind. But as the hearing approached, something unexpected happened. The anxiety began to fade. In its place came a calm confidence she barely recognized. Her circumstances had changed. More importantly, she had changed. The woman who once measured her worth through someone else's approval no longer existed. One afternoon, while finishing a client presentation, Charlotte received a message from an old acquaintance in Columbus. They had not spoken in months. The text seemed innocent enough. "Have you heard about Ryan lately?" Charlotte stared at the screen before replying with a simple no. The response arrived immediately. "Apparently, he has been telling people the hearing will finally settle everything. Sounds like he is pretty confident." Charlotte set her phone aside without answering. A year earlier those words would have ruined her day. Now they barely disturbed her concentration. Yet later that evening, as she walked home beneath rows of glowing streetlights, she found herself wondering why Ryan seemed so invested in one final appearance at court. The answer arrived sooner than expected. 2 days before the hearing, another acquaintance called unexpectedly. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that Ryan planned to bring several colleagues to the courthouse. Afterward, before hosting a celebratory lunch nearby, Charlotte listened quietly. The implication was impossible to miss. Ryan was treating the hearing less like a legal proceeding and more like a public confirmation of victory. Once again, he expected witnesses. Once again, he expected an audience. When the call ended, Charlotte stood silently beside her apartment window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Across the room, the court notice remained on the table. Her phone buzzed. "Jonathan, how was your evening?" Charlotte smiled despite herself. She told him about the conversation. Several seconds passed before his reply appeared. People who are truly secure rarely need spectators. She read the message twice, then laughed softly. That sounded exactly like something Jonathan would say. The following evening they met for dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. The atmosphere felt relaxed, but Charlotte noticed something different about Jonathan. Several times during the meal his phone received messages he ignored. Once, a man in an expensive suit entered the restaurant, recognized Jonathan immediately, and offered a respectful nod before moving to another table. Jonathan acknowledged him politely, but did not explain further. Charlotte noticed. She always noticed. Yet she said nothing. Instead, she asked the question weighing on her mind. "Do you think people can really change?" Jonathan looked out toward the water for a moment before answering. "The right people do not become someone else. They become more of who they already are." Charlotte considered that carefully. Ryan's success had not transformed him. It had revealed him, the same way hardship had revealed her. As the evening ended, Jonathan walked her to her car. Before she left, he handed her a small envelope. Charlotte looked surprised. "What is this?" Jonathan smiled. "Open it tomorrow morning." "That sounds mysterious." "It is meant to." She laughed and placed the envelope in her purse. The next morning arrived bright and clear. The hearing was less than 24 hours away. Charlotte opened the envelope while drinking coffee near the window. Inside was a simple handwritten note. 4 words. "You already won." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then her phone vibrated. Another text from Jonathan appeared beneath it. "Be ready at 9 tomorrow. I will take care of the rest." Charlotte looked from the note to the message and felt the same calm certainty she had felt in the courtroom a year earlier, when nobody understood why she was smiling. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary day. Inside her apartment, the final pieces were quietly falling into place. At 9 o'clock sharp, Charlotte stepped out of her apartment building carrying nothing but a leather handbag and a quiet sense of certainty. The morning air felt crisp. Sunlight reflected off rows of office windows across the street. For a moment, she wondered what the day would bring. Then her phone vibrated. A simple message from Jonathan. "I am outside." Charlotte smiled and walked toward the curb. Halfway there, she slowed. Parked beside the sidewalk was a black Rolls-Royce Phantom, polished so perfectly that the city skyline shimmered across its surface like glass. For several seconds, she simply stared. The vehicle looked completely out of place on her quiet street. A driver stood beside the rear passenger door waiting patiently. Charlotte glanced at her phone again to make sure she had not misunderstood the message. Before she could react, the driver opened the door and offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "I think there has been some mistake." No mistake, came a familiar voice from inside the car. Jonathan stepped out and smiled. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with effortless precision. Somehow he looked exactly the same and completely different at the same time. Ready? Charlotte looked from Jonathan to the car and back again. You never mentioned this. Jonathan's expression remained calm. You never asked. She laughed despite herself. During the drive downtown, Charlotte watched the city pass through tinted windows. Questions filled her mind, yet strangely, she felt no urgency to ask them. Whatever secrets surrounded Jonathan, they never seemed connected to ego. He never used status to impress anyone. He never spoke about wealth. He never needed attention. The silence felt comfortable. Across town, Ryan Hayes arrived at the courthouse nearly 40 minutes early. He stepped from his luxury sedan, wearing the confidence of a man expecting validation. Vanessa walked beside him carrying an expensive handbag and a practiced smile. Several colleagues from Ryan's company had accepted invitations to join them afterward for lunch. Two of them were already waiting near the entrance. Ryan shook hands, shared jokes, accepted compliments. More than once, someone asked whether Charlotte would actually show up. Ryan smirked. She will be here. The confidence in his voice carried an unmistakable edge. He wanted witnesses. He wanted closure. More than anything, he wanted confirmation that he had made the right choice. As the scheduled hearing approached, small groups gathered near the courthouse steps. Lawyers moved in and out of the building. Reporters passed occasionally. Conversations drifted through the warm morning air. Then something changed. It began subtly. Several people turned toward the street. A security guard straightened his posture. A valet near the entrance paused in the middle of a conversation. Ryan followed their gaze. A long black vehicle approached the courthouse at a measured pace. The polished grille caught the sunlight. The unmistakable silhouette drew attention immediately. The Rolls-Royce slowed before the entrance and came to a smooth stop. Curious conversations faded. Ryan frowned. The car itself was impressive, but that was not what unsettled him. It was the reaction around him. People were watching, waiting. The driver exited first and walked toward the rear passenger door. The courthouse steps grew strangely quiet. Ryan folded his arms. Vanessa adjusted her sunglasses. One of Ryan's colleagues whispered something under his breath. Then the door opened. A pair of elegant heels touched the pavement. Charlotte stepped out. The silence deepened instantly. Ryan's expression froze. For a second, he genuinely wondered whether he was looking at someone else. The woman standing beside that Rolls-Royce carried herself with a confidence he had never seen before. Calm, composed, untouchable. Charlotte looked toward the courthouse entrance without searching for Ryan, without acknowledging the crowd, without needing anyone's approval. Then she began walking forward, and every eye followed her. Charlotte felt dozens of eyes following her as she crossed the courthouse plaza. Some belonged to strangers. Others belonged to people who remembered exactly how she had left this same building a year earlier. The difference was impossible to ignore. Back then she had walked out carrying loss. Today she carried something far more powerful. Peace. Ryan watched her approach and struggled to hide his reaction. He had spent months imagining this day. In every version, Charlotte arrived looking defeated, uncertain, perhaps even resentful. Instead, she looked calm. The confidence in her posture unsettled him more than anger ever could. Vanessa noticed it too. Her smile faded slightly as Charlotte climbed the courthouse steps without once looking in their direction. Then another movement near the Rolls-Royce drew everyone's attention. The rear passenger door opened again. Jonathan stepped out. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Several people exchanged confused looks. A courthouse security officer straightened his jacket. An attorney standing near the entrance froze in place. Ryan frowned. He knew the face. He just could not immediately place it. Jonathan adjusted his suit jacket and began walking toward the entrance at an unhurried pace. There was no attempt to attract attention, no dramatic gesture. Yet the reaction around him intensified with every step. Halfway across the plaza, an older attorney hurried forward. "Mr. Blackwell," he said respectfully, "I did not know you would be attending today." Jonathan offered a polite handshake. "Good morning, David." Ryan felt something shift inside his chest. The name hit him first. Blackwell. Suddenly memories connected. Magazine covers. Business interviews. Industry headlines. Corporate acquisition announcements. Ryan's expression tightened. Beside him, one of his colleagues quietly muttered, "That cannot be Jonathan Blackwell." Another colleague looked stunned. It is. Vanessa turned toward Ryan. Who is he? Ryan did not answer immediately, because he already knew. Jonathan Blackwell was not merely successful. He was one of the most influential business leaders in the country, the founder and chairman of Blackwell Capital, a man whose investment group controlled companies across multiple industries, a man whose decisions appeared regularly in financial news, a man most people never met in person. Inside the courthouse lobby, the atmosphere changed even further. Employees greeted Jonathan by name. Attorneys acknowledged him respectfully. Charlotte noticed the reactions and finally looked toward him with raised eyebrows. Jonathan smiled slightly. I suppose there are a few things I should have explained. Charlotte laughed softly. A few. For the first time, Jonathan looked almost embarrassed. In my defense, our conversations were always more interesting than my biography. Before Charlotte could respond, another voice interrupted. Ryan had entered the lobby. The confidence that usually defined him seemed noticeably diminished. His eyes moved from Charlotte to Jonathan and back again. For several uncomfortable seconds, nobody spoke. Then one of Ryan's colleagues approached hurriedly. Ryan, he said quietly, you never mentioned your ex-wife knew Jonathan Blackwell. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Not because of what it implied, because of who heard it. Several nearby attorneys turned toward Ryan. The same people who once viewed him as the successful one were now looking at him differently. The balance of the room had shifted. Ryan could feel it. Charlotte could feel it too. Yet unlike Ryan, she showed no satisfaction, no triumph, no desire to embarrass him. She simply stood there, composed and graceful, while the truth revealed itself without her assistance. The hearing itself suddenly felt far less important than the realization spreading through the courthouse. For more than a year, everyone had assumed they understood Charlotte Hayes' story. They thought they knew who had won. They thought they knew who had lost. Now those assumptions were quietly collapsing in real time. And the most remarkable part was that Charlotte had never once tried to prove them wrong. The hearing lasted less than an hour. After months of anticipation, speculation, and carefully constructed expectations, the final legal matters were resolved with surprising simplicity. Documents were reviewed. Signatures were completed. Decisions were finalized. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public argument, no emotional speech. Life, Charlotte realized, rarely delivered closure the way people imagined. Most endings arrived quietly. Yet when the hearing concluded and people began filing out of the courtroom, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that had existed that morning. The assumptions had changed. The whispers had changed. Even the way people looked at Charlotte had changed. She gathered her documents and thanked her attorney. Across the room, Ryan stood speaking with several colleagues, but his confidence appeared strained now. More than once his eyes drifted toward Charlotte. Perhaps he was trying to understand what had happened. Perhaps he was realizing that success looked different than he once believed. Charlotte did not know. More importantly, she no longer cared. Outside the courthouse, sunlight warmed the stone steps. The city moved normally around them. Traffic flowed through intersections. Pedestrians crossed busy streets. The world had not stopped for anyone's personal victory or defeat. Jonathan waited near the curb beside the Rolls-Royce, speaking quietly with the driver. When he noticed Charlotte approaching, he immediately ended the conversation and smiled. The gesture was simple, respectful, natural, yet Ryan saw it. So did everyone else standing nearby. Not because Jonathan was wealthy, not because he was powerful, but because he treated Charlotte as though she mattered, as though her presence deserved consideration. Years ago, that had been all she ever wanted. Charlotte and Jonathan exchanged a few quiet words before walking toward the car. Then a familiar voice stopped her. Charlotte. She turned. Ryan stood several feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the city seemed distant. Ryan looked older than she remembered. Not physically. Something deeper. As though certainty had finally been replaced by reflection. You look well, he said. Charlotte smiled politely. Thank you. Another silence followed. Ryan glanced toward Jonathan, then back at her. I did not expect any of this. Charlotte understood exactly what he meant. He did not expect her confidence. He did not expect her growth. He did not expect the life she had built beyond his imagination. Most of all, he did not expect her happiness. Yet she felt no desire to make him uncomfortable. No need to remind him of past mistakes. Those burdens no longer belonged to her. Neither did I, she answered gently. Ryan nodded. The The response seemed to affect him more than any criticism could have, because it contained no resentment, no bitterness, only truth. A truth he could not change. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. There was nothing left to say. Charlotte offered a final polite smile and walked away. Jonathan opened the car door for her. As she settled into the back seat, she glanced through the window one last time. Ryan remained standing near the courthouse steps, watching quietly. Not angry, not defeated, simply confronted by the reality of what he had lost. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic. Downtown buildings reflected sunlight across the glass. Beside her, Jonathan remained silent, allowing her thoughts to settle. Charlotte looked out the window and watched the city pass by. A year earlier, she had left that courthouse believing everything was over. In reality, everything had just begun. She had not won because she found someone wealthier. She had not won because people finally admired her. She had not won because Ryan regretted his choices. She had won because she no longer needed any of those things. The approval she once chased now felt irrelevant. The pain she once carried no longer defined her. For the first time in years, her future belonged entirely to her. A small smile touched her face as the city unfolded beyond the glass. She did not win him back. She won herself.